Hi, everyone. This is Diane Summers, president of the American Rose Society. We are here today with Jackson and Perkins and my good friend, Wes Harville, to talk about soil.
Yes, this is where it all starts, Diane. This should be a good one.
Yeah, soil is something I think we all take for granted until we realize we don't have good soil. And, this kind of a topic is really valuable for all of our plants, not just roses.
I agree. Like I said before, it all starts in the soil. It's surprising what cannot happen if you don't have the proper elements in place.
A few years back, it was about 8 years ago, I moved from my current home about 10 miles west. And I never thought about the soil being an issue when I planted my roses in my new garden. But the soil, even just 10 miles away, is very different. And it took me a while to pause and think about how do I make my soil better for my plants. So I think this will be valuable for all of us. It's a great refresher for me as well. And looking forward to talking more about this today. When we talk about planting and taking care of our roses, or again, any other plants, we need to look at the components of healthy soil. And surprisingly, air and water are large components in our soil. We may not realize that until, of course, we start to have a problem. Typically, 45% of the components of our soil is made up of minerals. And that comes from the bedrock or what your land is on, right? And so as the rock kind of breaks down, it starts to form the minerals in your soil. And they're very important for the growth of any of your plants. So for example, if you have your bedrock is limestone, that's what is in my area, then we tend to have more clay in our soil. So that's where it comes from. It starts from the bedrock. And of course, organic matter is extremely important as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So that makes up the components of the soil. We've often spoke about planting in the right location. And of course, that means when you're talking about roses, making sure they're getting enough sun with a minimum of 6 hours of sun a day. Using good soil is what we're going to spend our time on today, as well as how we can prepare the soil, how we can amend the soil so it's better for our rose bushes and every other plant.
We're also going to look at some considerations when you can have all the proper elements there, but these nutrients, soil microorganisms, are not available to the plant because of particular characteristics of the soil.
Absolutely. And that's where we need to spend time because it's just something that might surprise all of us. All of our soils are a little bit different. And so we can start by talking about the actual texture of our soil, because that's important and that'll help us understand if in fact we need to do any kind of amendments in our soil. This chart we see here is a simple chart that you can find in a lot of areas on the internet that help you determine what kind of soil texture you have. And simply to do this, you can take like a cup of soil from your garden, place it into like a quart jar, fill it full of water, shake it up really well with a couple drops of like a dish detergent that'll help break the surface tension, and wait a while and you'll start to see these layers form, and you'll have a better understanding of how much clay, how much sand, how much silt you have in your soil. And that's the first step to understand what kind of soil you actually have.
I've seen, farmers walk through the field, whether they're rose growers or corn croppers, and, just pick up a hand of soil. You can pick it up, and if it's slightly moist, if you squeeze your thumb against the palm of your hand and that soil makes ribbons, it tends to be more of a clay soil. Or if you just shift by moving the palm of your hand back and forth, that soil in your hand, and it breaks up in chunks and falls away, it's typically more loamy. But just a good place to start to see the big picture and what you're dealing with soil.
When I moved to my new home, I wanted to make sure I got rid of clay, because in my old garden, I was always battling clay. And as I worked with the individuals doing our landscape, they assured me it would not have clay. And I was pleased because I had so much drainage in my soil. And as we talk about that, it's because the percentage of sand in my soil was so much higher. But at the same point in time, not having enough clay or silt, all of a sudden my soil, the water was completely draining on a very fast, very quickly. And I didn't even have water enough for my plant. So again, understanding that texture is really important. Our roses grow best in a sandy clay soil, more of like the loam, I guess. And it's not just roses, other plants do as well. Organic matter is also very important to the soil, even though, as we saw in the earlier chart, it's only 5% of a component of our soil, because that always helps to feed the organisms in our soil, which are so very important in order to break down the minerals and have those available for our plant nutrients. And the organic matter can also help by adjusting our pH if it's too high or if it's too low. It can help increase that water capacity, holding capacity in our sandy soils, such as in my case, where I had to start adding a lot more organic matter. It can help if you've got a lot of clay. And typically now in an established garden, I use it just as a top dressing every year to help amend my soil and give my organisms some nutrients and a kickstart in the spring.
Yes, and that top dressing starts to break down, like you were saying, and as you plant new roses or any other flowers in your garden, it continues to break down and continues to amend that top level of soil and increase the organic matter over time. So there's really no need to ever remove your mulch or any of the organic matter that you're using on the top of your soil.
That's right. You'll start to see that the organisms are enjoying that mulch. They're enjoying the organic matter. And as they're feeding and helping the plant to be able to take up nutrients, they're moving around in the soil. And when they do that, they're creating little pockets for that water to pass through. And they're also creating opportunities for air, which is really important for our plants, even under the soil surface.
Yes, because without the air and the water, the roots won't go there. And without the roots going deep and penetrating into the soil profile, it reduces their freeze tolerance, it reduces their ability to deal with stress. So getting air and water into the depth of your profile is very important so that you get root development.
Here's another picture of soil structure. And the sandy types of soils are going to be made up of larger particles, and that actually enables the water to move through the soil faster. When we think about clay soils, the particles themselves are very small, and so they bind together more closely, and that really restricts the water from being able to move throughout the soil.
Yes, and as you were saying, the finer it is, the more hard the individual minerals and moisture in the soil adheres to that soil surface. And we talk about minerals and water being available to plants. So if you have a very, very fine texture, you may have a great deal of nutrients in the soil. They're just not available to the plant because they're bound too tightly.
And the soil structure also determines how much watering you should do in your soil. So if you have that real sandy soil, you have the water passing quickly, then you may need to water more frequently than somebody who has a very much of a clay soil. And of course, getting to that sandy loam mix is what we're trying to achieve. At that point, the soil is absorbing, has the right amount of moisture content, and it has the right amount of air going through it. And the organisms are helping to continue to amend that soil and make sure that the nutrients are being taken up. So let's talk a little bit about rose bed soil requirements. Wes, as you just said a few moments ago, we want to make sure that the soil is moist, but well drained. We have often talked about, the roots don't like to be sitting in water. And why is that? Because again, they aren't getting the air that they need in order to continue to be healthy and to take up those nutrients in the soil. We'd like to have that organic matter, and that again helps that texture, and it enables the organisms to do their thing and help us in growing our roses. You don't want to just amend a planting hole, because what happens is that you create like a plate, if you will, between what you're filling your hole with and what the texture is of your soil. And what happens is then the water, again, cannot move through those various layers. You have to make sure that there's a mixture, if you're going to be amending your soil, that helps that water continue to drain as it's going through different types of soil structure.
I know that,
go ahead, Wes.
You use terms like moist and well drained, and to some people they may sound like one and the same, but again, that's your soil test, where you just grab a handful of the soil and feel it, and you feel it, it looks moist, it feels moist, it sticks to your hand, but yet when you add water to it and pour it through the soil profile, it drains away quickly.
Yes, if you've ever dug a hole to plant something and you place some water in it, right? And you see that the water is just sitting there, that's an obvious clue that it's probably not a good place to put your plant without amending that soil and correcting that soil a bit. And at the same time, and I have this right now in my garden a bit, if you dig a hole and you put some water in it and zoom, it's gone, that also tells you that, okay, you might need to think about amending your soil and adding more compost to it, more organic matter.
We talk a lot about organic matter, and I'm sure some people are going, what is that? And, as we've listed here, organic matter is typically, rotted cow manure, chicken manure, or yard compost. But the key here is that it's well rotted, it's decomposed, it's not green. You can't use green grass clippings on top of your roses. It actually heats up the soil unnaturally and can rob the soil away from nutrients. So you want to make sure that you're using well-rotted organic matter in your process, both planting and top dressing.
And if we think back again to that first slide, we said that this organic matter was about 5% of the soil structure. You actually could have too much organic matter in. Remember, we need air, we need water, and we need the minerals in our soil. So that's why, even though 5% might seem like a small amount, it's enough. And you couldn't just plant a planting compost, I guess, is the key there. So try to, amend the soil. Yes, compost is very important, but you can't overdo it, I guess, is what I want to say. Now, ideally, you'd like to start thinking about adding and amending your soil and preparing for a new garden in the fall. But lots of us at this time of year are anxious to get going and decide we need more flowers, we need more plants, we need more roses, right? So you really can start a new bed at any time of the year.
Here's a topic that everybody wants to know about.
Oh, well, pH sounds like a very chemical, complicated thing, and it doesn't need to be. But pH is just basically a measure of the amount of hydrogen ion in your soil, and we can leave it at that. The pH that is ideal for roses is about a 6.5. And the pH is really just measuring the amount of, if your soil is acidic, which would make it a lower pH, or alkaline, which makes it a higher pH. And the pH is important because different nutrients become available to the plant depending upon the pH. And so we're trying to hit that sweet spot where more nutrients are going to be available for uptake in the plant. when I was early in my rose gardening career, I'll call it, I actually kept putting all of this fertilizer in my plants, and they really weren't growing any better. And I found out that my pH was 8. And so at that level, the nutrients I was adding weren't even being absorbed by the plant. So before you start anything, start with a pH test. That'll show you that you have the right pH. And if you do send it to, let's say, a county extension office, which is what I do, it'll also let you know what nutrients you might need to add, which nutrients are missing from your soil.
And we want to emphasize here that it's, this isn't unique to roses. The particular pH may be unique to roses, but all roses require all plants require a particular pH to flourish. The interesting thing too is that the pH, like Diane said, helps fertilizers and nutrients be more available in the soils and to the roots, but it also helps microorganisms that break down those micronutrients and make them available to the plants flourish.
I agree. And from what I've been able to read, really this pH of about 6.5 is not only good for roses, but a similar pH is good for many other plants. There are some plants that you may know of that require even a more acidic or lower pH. So understanding that the pH of your soil is important. And, there are many ways to do that, again, from the simple pH testing strips that you can buy at your local store to actually sending it off to the extension services. Some of the tips for adjusting your soil pH is if you want to lower your pH, but you can add sulfur to it. And if you want to increase your pH, then you can add lime to it. Please make sure that you're following the directions on the packages so that you're not, again, overdoing it. Some of these changes will happen over time. And you put it on your soil and sprinkle it into your soil. I actually do a pH test on my beds once a year to make sure that my pH is acceptable as I'm still amending my soil over all these years. And by doing that, I take different pH samples from different beds and I send them separately into the extension service.
And they use a term called incorporation. Anytime you're working with any application on a soil surface that's granular or even textural, like sand or fertilizer, you need to do your best to incorporate that or work that into the soil profile, because depending on the soil profile and your pH, those nutrients and materials can move really slowly through that soil and not be available for long periods of time.
That is absolutely true. So I tend to do all of this in the spring because that's before I put my mulch on my soil, right? So I'm testing my pH and understanding what kind of amendments I might need to add. I'm putting compost on my plants in the spring, and then the final dressing is my mulch, and then they're ready for the year.
Yeah, and just reviewing the pH on a regular basis, like Diane said, is important. And some of the things that affect that could be, rainfall, an unusually large amount, or your soil structure, or the particular chemicals that you add to the soil, and the availability or lack of availability of microorganisms to utilize or to break down those nutrients.
Yep. It sounds complicated, but it really isn't. And a few simple, steps in the spring will help assure that your plants, including your roses, do well throughout the summer months. Well, Wes, I'd like to thank you for joining me in this interesting discussion today. I really think that getting the soil in a better place is one of the very first steps in growing a beautiful garden.
It all starts there, Diane. Thank you.